Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
Invariably, when you engage a pastor who is in this place of pain and woundedness and perhaps is beginning to wound others or maybe has stepped out of ministry, they were doing it alone. Now they'll say, oh, no. I had so many good friends in ministry, but those friends were direct report staff members that experienced the wrath of this pastor or the manipulation or other things like that. Oh, no. I've got a therapist, but it turns out that therapist, they weren't really doing a lot of work. In fact, the therapist was saying, good job, appreciate you, brother. You just keep drinking deep of the gospel and everything will be fine. But they weren't really doing the soul work, What we find is these guys, mostly guys, but there are women too, are really alone. They've had no one to talk to. They feel like if they're really vulnerable, they're afraid of what's going to happen. They're afraid of losing it all. They've learned to self-protect and they've become pretty insulated. And vulnerability is just really, really scary. And so, that sense that we were talking about in my story pretty early on where I didn't hit eject, I stayed in it. I didn't have a whole lot to lose. I was still pretty early in the game. But if you're the pastor of a church of 500, 1,000, 3,000, whatever it might be, or the head of a ministry, and you're sitting with a guy like me, and I'm saying the path looks like this. And you're like, well, the path that got me here looks like this, I just kind of clench my teeth and I do this thing,
Totally.
It's going to be really tough.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. This week's episode is a continuation of our Leadership Under Pressure series. In this episode, Jay will be talking with Dr. Chuck DeGroat, an author, licensed therapist, and spiritual director. Let's listen in.
Chuck, thanks for joining us. We were just catching up a moment ago. We've not ever hung out. So you did this in complete faith and confidence that it would be worth your time. And that means a lot to me. So thank you for doing that.
But we share some really, really good friends. So
we
that
do.
helps.
Yeah, we really do. We do. Well, yeah, I mean, I've heard wonderful things about you for years and years. And because you live such a public life, you've written so much on podcasts and things, I get to understand bits of how you're thinking. But you have no idea what we're doing. So I really appreciate you being willing to talk for a bit. So let's start where all good stories start, which is where you were born and where you grew up.
Yeah. So Long Island, New York. So if you would have caught me about 18, 20, well, maybe 25 years ago, 30 years ago now, I would have had that thick New York accent. Both of my parents grew up in Brooklyn and Jamaica, Queens. And so, but you can occasionally hear it. But Suffolk County, Long Island, New York.
But where in Long Island?
So to shrink it a little bit, Suffolk County, which is the eastern portion of the island, town of Islip, a little hamlet called Bohemia, New York.
Yeah. I know where that is. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that as far as like, if nobody's ever been to Long Island, I went on vacation there 2 summers ago. First of all, I couldn't believe how big it was. I mean, to just drive the length of that thing is insane. Yeah. I'm a golfer, so some of the best golf in the world right there. Beautiful beaches. Insane amounts of money, but then lots of places don't have insane amounts of money. So it's an interesting mix of things. Yeah. It's like,
we certainly didn't grow up with any amount of money. So
Okay. So you grow up there with probably going into the city and doing those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's right.
What was like, what were your parents do that put them in New York or on Long Island? What was kind of their profession? Yeah. What did they do?
They grew up, my mom in Brooklyn, my dad in Jamaica, and they were part of that white flight from the city back in the late 50s, 1960s, where Long Island was being built out. There's a whole story there that is a sort of challenging one to process about how they built these communities and really tried to create this sort of idyllic life for folks like my parents who'd grown up in the city, in these new suburban communities, these houses that looked exactly alike and these identical plots. And so my parents were actually married in 56. I came along in 70. They had a number of miscarriages, battle with addiction, all marriage issues, and did later eventually get divorced. And so, but when I came along, just to give you a little sort of window into why I ended up a pastor and a therapist. It was like 14 years later, right after they got married, it was like this, he's going to keep us together. Like, here's the glue, right now that Chuck's born. So yeah, those parts of our stories kind of matter, it turns out.
Yeah,
And,
totally.
that's just a little window into it.
And what kind of kid were you? Were you jock kid, musician, geek? Well, there's usually a stream, right? You pick a crew.
Yeah, well, in our high school, 2,100 students in our high school, so real big high school, and lots of, those kind of little tribes, right? I was in the band. I was a trombone player. We marched in all the big parades, in the city, and got to march at a New York Giants game in front of Bill Parcells way back in the day. And so
that's cool.
it was fun. And that was like the little clique, right? That was my little tribe in the band. And, that, of course, these little groups, they're places where you find some sense of identity and belonging and all of those different kinds of things. And I was a pretty anxious kid. And so it was important to find my way into, even the trombone players had their own sense of belonging,
own little world. That's so great. Okay. And so then as you're growing up, is faith central to your life? Or is it like we're church people or?
Yeah.
Not really.
Yeah, it turns out my parents played basketball in the Lutheran League in the city, and both of them. And so when I came along, they thought, we have to take this kid to a Lutheran church and get him baptized. And it stuck. And in Long Island in the 1970s, there was this kind of rise of charismatic evangelicalism, for lack of a better way of saying it, even within the Lutheran church. And so they got caught up in this sort of like a revivalist kind of movement back in the day. And so they renounced everything, when they became Christians. I didn't have a very fun upbringing, and so
right. So the music's different. Yeah, everything. Right.
Yeah, I mean, the way they talk about their lives before I came along and after, it was like you had all the fun, and then I came along.
Right.
Yeah, so, and I was the oldest. My sister came along about, 17, 18 months later, something like that. And so there was this sense of like they were getting their footing in faith. And I was an experiment in that, getting their footing in faith. And so it was tough, not a great marriage, not poor, but not middle class.
Right.
My dad worked in the city for part of the time and then New Jersey. And so 2.5 hours to work sometimes and back.
Wow.
And worked evenings. So he was never around. And yet this growing sense of faith and new community that comes with being a part of a very alive kind of church at that time, And so as I look back, there's a lot going on, and I didn't really have categories to make sense of it, but I was in the middle of it.
Yeah. So it means, if you're in one of those kind of renewal movements, it means church is a big deal. Like
that's right.
Whether we know what we're doing or not is different, but you're probably doing youth group, you're going on Sundays, we're not allowed to watch the Smurfs. We're into DC talk stuff. So you're in that era. Okay. That's interesting. And so as you're getting towards the end of high school, is God grabbing hold of your life in such a way that you're like, man, I think I'm going to do ministry, or are you thinking another career path?
No, I had some people in my life, not least a youth pastor, who thought I had some promise for ministry. And so that was a real conversation in high school. I ended up going into an aeronautics program in college.
Wow.
Thinking that I was doing kind of like a Navy ROTC aeronautics kind of thing. And then my vision wasn't good enough for that. And so I ended up transferring colleges to a Christian college in Iowa, which took me off of Long Island for the first time. And so there was a big transition there, but ministry was always kind of like looming in the background. So when I went to college, to this, it's called Dort College, D-O-R-D-T.
Yeah, I know that school.
Liberal Arts College in this Long Island kid with a thick accent who used to dress in black, going to Northwest Iowa. It was very different. Yeah. Just massive culture change. But yeah, I became pre-sem in philosophy, and I was thinking about seminary at that time only because, as a kid from a home where my dad wasn't around a lot, my parents' marriage wasn't great. My youth pastor was like up here, right? And so I idealized him and his life and his family. Turns out all of that blew up at some point, right? But that's a redemption story we can talk about. But it was a big deal, I think, as I watched his life and how he showed. I thought, yeah, I want to go to the seminary I want to be formed by the people he was formed by, and eventually sort of made my way there after college and after a couple of years in Chicago.
Ah, okay. And so do you have, because you're from this kind of charismatic-y thing, do you have a sense of calling? Like, man, I've had this encounter with God, or is it more like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's working.
Yeah.
The next thing.
Yeah. There was some calling. It was caught up in a relationship with my then girlfriend, future wife. Right. And so, a lot of that came into the mix of what do we want? I wasn't entirely sure. I was thinking about maybe doing a PhD program because I learned in college that I was pretty good at academics. And so, but eventually we reconnected with this youth pastor who ended up marrying us and who said at my wedding during his homily that I was going into ministry. And I hadn't said that to anyone, and I wasn't really thinking that.
You're like, I don't remember
he sort of
saying
declared
that.
it. And then people started coming up to me and saying, well, are you going into ministry? And I'm not saying I did it, but I thought, well, maybe I should look into seminary. And my dad and mom had separated. My dad was down in Orlando. This youth pastor seminary was down in Orlando. And so I thought, well, Orlando sounds pretty good. Iowa's been cold. Chicago's really cold. That'd be nice. Palm trees and a pool in our apartment complex, and studying Greek doesn't sound too bad.
Yeah, exactly. And where were you in Chicago again?
My wife was a few years younger than me. She had to do part of her degree in Chicago for nursing. And so we were in like the, what would you say, like the southwest suburbs, Palos Heights area. Okay. And so we lived there. Well, she went to Trinity Christian College. And so, I worked retail in Chicago for 2 years, and that was great. As a philosophy major, what else are you going to do?
Yeah, well, exactly. By the way, that's my degree. My degree is in philosophy. Yeah. So you're great in a coffee shop. That's your zone. But outside of that,
well, I sold high-end electronics. So I sold, big, expensive tube TVs, laser discs. The old laser discs.
Yeah, the big ones. Totally.
Yeah, high-end VHS decks, and so
great. Yeah, just what you planned on doing. That's why you go to school. You want to do that with your life. Yeah, isn't that fascinating? Okay, so you're good Lutheran still, I assume, while you're doing all this.
By then I made my way to more of a Reformed context because that's what all good. Like you start as a charismatic Lutheran, And then you get a pastor in your life who says that's all just touchy-feely, and you've got to go up here and stay up here for the rest of your life.
Right. Stay in your head.
Stay in your head, and also you got to be with the people who are right. So
totally.
So I found my way. Aren't you glad I found my way to the tribe that was right? So
well, it's got to feel good. It feels good for a while anyway. You get that.
Oh. Feels so good when you're in your early 20s,
Strength and totally. Great. Yeah, I get it. So now you're in Orlando doing your seminary. You obviously move towards more clinical thinking, with the work that you do. What are the turns that might make you start to say, hey, I'm not just a theological pastor, philosopher guy. I'm going to start dialing in on people's lives. What were the turns that started to make that happen?
Two main things. One, I went over to Oxford University to study to try to get a recommendation from a prof that I was connected with over there to study with a New Testament Book of Revelation scholar named Richard Bauckham.
Oh man,
and
Bauckham's the man.
So I went over there and I started studying apocalyptic literature, and I was in the basement of the Bodleian Library every single day by myself in my head.
Wow.
And but at night, I was hanging out with undergrads and grads and connecting about life, particularly with the undergrads who had relationship issues and other things. By then, I was married. So I was like, this doesn't really compute. Like, I don't love being in the basement. I don't know if I can do that for 5 years.
Right.
And then I was studying apocalyptic, and maybe this is just like too much for the podcast, but the fascinating thing about it, as I was studying the book of Revelation, is that it was written in a time of immense suffering. It was a pastoral book, and I'd never thought of the book of Revelation as a really practical pastoral work at some level. And I thought, I have to, if I'm going to have any credibility, I have to have some pastoral skin in the game to engage this. I sat down with a counseling prof at my seminary, and he took the conversation in a very different direction. He basically looked at me and he said, Chuck, some version of like, Chuck, you're a mess. You're up here. You're arrogant. You think you've got it figured out. You're going to be dangerous to the church. You're probably already dangerous to your wife. You need to do some significant work. He knew that it was probably not smart to say, get into counseling, because I would have rejected it, wholesale at that point. But he said, why don't you jump in and instead of going off and doing your PhD right away, do a master's in counseling and then go do your PhD. Wow. And I thought, I can justify another degree. I might not be able to justify counseling.
Right.
Well, it turns out the 2-year degree was like, I jumped in the deep end of the deep work. And so that began the inner process, right? At about 27 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
Somebody go give that prof a raise. We need professors. We need people in the academy to notice things like that.
Yeah.
And push people toward their own hearts and their own lives. That's good for him. Grateful for him.
He didn't mince words. He just said it how it was. Some people hear that story and they're like, that seems kind of intense. And I think that's what I needed to hear at that point.
Totally. Okay. And so what are the main turning points for you as you're doing that study? Because again, there's a way to do a master's in counseling and sort of fight it the whole way.
Yeah, that's right.
Or intellectualize it enough that you're like, okay, I've got some tools I'm picking up here. How do those turns start to happen for you? Yeah,
that was impossible in this program. It was a very relationally oriented program. A lot of immediacy, a lot of one-on-one. Some people know, if they've read this book I wrote on narcissism in the church, that I've had this question I've asked for years: how do you experience me? And I think it's a question that every leader needs to ask at some level. That began at the age of 27 as I sat with fellow students. Now, I entered into the program as an MDiv student. I think I was the second MDiv student ever to go through this program. And they're mostly women who are suspicious of us, because the men do the MDiv and the women do the counseling program. So now Chuck comes in, and what I start hearing is, I don't feel safe with you. You're arrogant. I'm not sure I want to continue in this program. If you're in this program with me, I don't want to be in a group with you.
Wow.
I don't feel safe with you counseling in this exercise we're doing in this class. And so that was like the second part. It was like the prof who said, you're dangerous. The second part was fellow students, supervisors. I remember doing some counseling with a young woman, and I thought I was doing such a great job. And I thought I was building trust. We were talking about music and other things. And my supervisor grabs me after the session. We sit down with some other students who are watching the session. And after a little while, she says, so you call flirtation for an hour counseling? Oof. And boom, there it is. 27-year-old Chuck. Now, I was resistant to that for about 10 minutes. And for the next 40 minutes, I cried as they made their way into my story and traced my, some of my relationship with my mom and girls. And there was just a lot that went on in that next 40 minutes that I had to tease out. So it was a lot, man.
I'd say, and to be 27, you're married at this point.
Yeah.
So it's like, gosh, you're saying a bunch of things about me I don't want to believe are true. I don't want to believe that's true.
Yeah.
And or that's not my intention. So
That's right.
the fact you're experiencing me in a way that I don't want to think is true, and I don't know that I'm kind of creating this impact is a shockingly difficult thing to process at any age, but definitely.
Yeah, it feels like an enormous gift at that age. We had been married for 3 years. I often say that Sarah and I married each other's false selves, and this blew things up for me and for us. And so we had a lot of work to do. She would end up going and getting her counseling degree a little bit later. But I think at the same time, I'm now rethinking PhD studies. I'm pretty convinced I just need to go into pastoral work and stay local and stay within this community. So I'm becoming wiser at this point. I know that the best thing for me is to not be sitting in a library for 5 years, but to be in really accountable community. And we ended up in Orlando for 14 years before making our way out to San Francisco. And so that was a really formative season. It was a hard season too, because that's we can get into that if you want to. I ended up fired after 6 years in my first ministry role.
Wow.
But it was a really formative season in large part because these counseling supervisors and students who were in my life remained in my life. And I continued to grow through those relationships.
So what I find, and of course I have read bits and pieces of this and some of your work, but what do you think made it so you didn't just eject? Most people in those kinds of things just eject. Like, this is too intense. Yeah. I feel too awkward.
Yeah.
I'm pretty smart. I mean, I think so many people, with the level of sort of intellectual power you were bringing into those conversations are like, listen, I don't have to do this crazy thing. Like, I'm a pretty bright guy. I can do smart things. I can impress most people I bump into. When you think back even on, how do you think you navigate? How did you get through that?
Yeah. I think maybe the best way of saying it is it was the gift of being caught or the gift of being found out, that there was such relief for the parts of me that, trying to hold it together and stay in control. And I was able to exhale and in that space be known. And, this kid who was wearing this mask of competence and academic ability and all these other things was carrying a lot of shame and insecurity and fear and anxiety. And so that was a space where it was pretty stark, right? Because here I am in classes, I'm still in MDiv classes where they want the version of me that's put together. Sure. And I'm in this other space where I'm mostly in tears during conversations and sessions and other things. And so, there was a lot going on. No part of me wanted to hit eject. I felt so seen, known, held, loved. And it really did feel like this is it. Whatever this is, I can't go back to that old place, that old life up here.
What a gift. And honestly, how unusual. I mean, you've done a lot of work clinically or as a pastor. Yeah. The amount of times you can get to a place like that with someone and then you can just feel them trying to run out of the room as fast as they can to kind of get back to whatever they were doing. Like, man, whatever this is, I'm out. I got to get out of here. Yeah. But there are the rare exceptions. People are like, no, this is healing. This is hard, but it's healing. I'm going to stay here. Yeah. So then you take some of those skills into being a pastor. So now you're on staff at a church. Did you plant a church? Did you go on staff at a church?
I went on staff at a church. It was a church that, you might remember this. Back in the late 90s, Robert Weber was writing The Younger Evangelicals. There was this, I'm a Gen Xer. We were beginning to ask questions about how the boomers were doing church, totally. Right? And it was happy. And, I was a part of one of those churches. So I ended up planting a church within that church, as a number of us did back then in the midst of this growing emergent movement. And as we were exploring intersections of liturgy and art and other things. And so we ended up within that church, planning a church. It was like the church for the freaks and the geeks, and
Yeah, totally.
the art and poetry and liturgy and all these things. And if you didn't belong in the shiny happy service, you come to our service with all your issues, with all your brokenness. And that, what I'd say is, it was really beautiful, and yet there was a different kind of shift happening within me. Like at one point, I was sort of enlightened because of my intellectual abilities and my performance, in the academic world. And now I think we were beginning to think, oh, we've got this other thing figured out. Like and my friends have the emotional and spiritual life figured out. Like we really get it. And you boomers don't, which led to conflict with my pastor. And so there's a new kind of arrogance developing within me, a new kind of enlightenment that I grabbed hold of. And so, like that story is an ongoing story, because that's the temptation with every new thing. Like I've got it figured out. Here's my new tribe. Here's my new sense of security, my sense of belonging. Yeah.
Well, and you have a strong critique that is helping a lot of people. So, okay, now I'm getting validated in my critique and in my new way.
Yeah.
And yet it's exactly what you're saying. You can form a new kind of arrogant insanity. And the thing you're describing, I was one of those things too in Columbus. So we built a bunch of small groups that grew into a young adult ministry. And, there's all the inherent tensions. There's this big smoking pit people would effectively walk through to come in, and it's the height of 90s grunge. The whole that's right. That's the whole vibe, man, was like, we are so authentic, it hurts. Like there is nobody more real than us. That
was it. 100%. That was it.
There's something really sweet and beautiful about that, but it was also like, I look back like, I don't think we really knew what we were doing. Okay, so that flies apart at some point. Like, okay.
Yeah, I call my senior pastor a narcissist with an explicative, and that doesn't end well. So that's a complicated story to tell.
I'm sure.
There's been reconciliation and things like that.
Amen.
But it'd be easy to say I was right and he was wrong. I had it figured out. He didn't. But it's more complicated than that. Because I ended up writing. Whenever you write a book on narcissism, people are going to go back and say, well, were you writing it about that? Were you writing it about this situation where you are now? And no, not necessarily. And there are threads that for sure informed it, but there are threads in my own life that were informing that, right? So
that's right. Okay, so I think so it's really helpful to hear some of your background, because it describes how you have a heart for pastors, you have a heart for pastoral ministry, you have theological education, but you have this clinical development. It's really about your own life as much as helping other people. And of course, what you've written about with narcissism definitely has struck a nerve within this current moment we're in, and sort of this pseudo-evangelical, and I know that is becoming more and more a bad word, but so whatever we would have known as evangelicalism, and however people are trying to redefine themselves within that. And there seems to be this strain of leaders who are being outed, discovered, confronted with these sort of models of never-ending growth, limitless leadership development, hard-charging, powerful, big building, church growth things seem to, and this is where I think some of your work's interesting, attract that kind of leader, or maybe even produce a certain kind of leader. And of course, our thing, the Vineyard, we were out of the church growth movement. Wimber was leading a lot of the church growth thinking out of Fuller. So give like a little summary of some of what we're starting to notice. Whether we can pick the easy targets. We can pick the Driscolls and the Hybels, and there's easy targets, but there's less easy targets. There's less famous stories.
Church pastor.
That's right. So talk a little bit about what your research started to show, how you're trying to be helpful to this larger conversation.
For me, this goes back 25 or more years now to my work with women in this context who are experiencing abuse, particularly in complementarian contexts.
Yeah.
It goes back to doing church planting assessments in the early 2000s and seeing what you rightly point out. It's not just the individual. It's not just the pastor, right? It's the systems. It's what we were asking of these pastors. It was the assessment processes. It was, rewarding the good-looking guy with the good-looking wife who'd already raised $250,000, whose gifts had gotten ahead of his sense of character. But hey, we've got an opportunity, and there's an opportunity for the kingdom. It's really interesting to me that when the Narcissism book came out in 2020, the first call I got was from someone I used to do those assessments with, who said to me, "You were the guy who used to, raise the yellow flag, the red flag," and we would say, "No, you counselors, you're always going to do that, but this guy's gifted and he's ready to go." And he's like, "We've seen so many of those guys go down in flames over the years, So you've been around for a long time. I've witnessed this for a long time. The research is really in the work that began back in the day. My PhD work ended up being in pastoral formation as I was doing some teaching within the seminary and recognizing that seminaries weren't preparing students for the realities. They weren't forming women and men for the complexities of ministry, let alone the complexities of their own hearts.
Yeah.
And then my work out in San Francisco, where we were attempting to start sort of a different kind of seminary, a missional training center out on the West Coast that lasted probably 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. I mean, we had bigger ideas than we could execute, I think. But there was a hope there that we could be involved in producing a different kind of church planter, a healthier church planter. Yep. It turns out it's just really tough for those of us who've been in ministry, for those of us in seminary education. It's easy, from the sidelines to say, if you just did that differently, if you taught this course, or if you, I've tried to teach the courses, in fact, I've mentored a couple of, we're not going to talk specifics or names, but I've been the mentor to a couple of well-known men who blew up, and I thought we were having the real conversations. I thought the therapy was doing its work, and so if you do this for a while, you recognize that there are a lot of things that you think will work, a lot of control that you try to take in the process of, formation. And a lot of it does end up kind of blowing up in your face. And I do think it gets at the systems that are so ingrained, the way we think about the formation of pastors, the way we narrate success stories, the way we fund. There are so many different conversations we could have around the intersections of this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the quote I love to use specifically with church planters is the old prophet Mike Tyson, who says, I can't remember who he's fighting. It might have been the Sphinx fight. And they interview Sphinx and he says all the things he's going to do. I'm going to make sure I get inside on Mike and then I'm going to keep in a distance and I'm going to stay to his right side. And he's just staring straight ahead during the entire part of the interview. And then finally he asks Mike, what do you want to say? He goes, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the mouth. And
that's so good. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain amount of training you can do.
Yes.
Until you hit your capacity, hit your edge.
Yeah.
Everybody has those.
Right.
You just don't know where they are. You don't know exactly what you're going to do. It's like, I was, there was a guy who I played golf with who got bit by a rattlesnake a few weeks ago. And he said he got bit and he literally walked up the hill and just laid down. And some people came up and said, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I don't know. I just got bit by a snake." And I said, "So why did you do that?" He goes, "I don't know, man. Do you know what you would do if you were bit by a rattlesnake?" I said, "Yeah, I don't actually. Yeah. I don't know I know what I think I would do."
No. and so little power, so little control. I think of some of these guys who I've mentored or taught at the seminary at various iterations of my own ministry career and seminary training. And they got the therapy, they knew their Enneagram type, they had done some story work, they
Right.
connected the dots, right? But when they started to get power, and as the
Yes.
church grew, there was that sense that if the church got to this level,
Totally.
my anxiety would go away, things would go well, but the anxiety only grew. And then
Totally.
church gets to 1,500 and 2,000, and the anxiety grows even more. And now the slings from people, there are more of them, the
Yes.
emails, the pushback from the elders, the hard congregational meetings, and they become a little bit more insulated, maybe still see a therapist here and there, but they don't realize how wounded they really are.
That's right.
And they start insulating and self-protecting and preserving power. And before you know it, I mean, I've debriefed with some of these guys who are like, I don't know how that happened in the
Yes.
span of about 7 years. I think I went from pretty healthy and pretty self-aware to pretty self-protective and insulated and ultimately really wounded and acting out of that wounding and wounding others.
If you're interested in more of the work Vineyard USA is doing to promote healthy pastors and leaders, we'd encourage you to check out the Pastoral Health Information page on our website. Go to vineyardusa.org/pastoral health to learn about resources, upcoming cohorts, and support from the Vineyard USA team.
Even if it isn't major trauma, there is death by paper cuts.
Yeah,
There
right.
is the
Right.
kind of continual, slow messiness of life. And P.S., we haven't even talked about the fact that it turns out our families don't just behave themselves behind the scenes. It's not like, your kids are going to just do what you want them to do, or your
That's
marriage will just sort of tack along easily because you love the Lord. Actually, there's quite a bit more suffering. And so given all the things you're aware of that you're noticing, there is no magic formula. There is mystery and humility that's required. But what do you think you're starting to notice when you think about the systems that are formed, the way people are trying to behave in these systems? When you're talking to that pastor who shows up and has that moment of clarity where they go, something's off. I don't know what's off. Something's off.
Yeah.
Nobody wakes up one day and says, I think I would like to be a narcissist, or I'd like to build a narcissistic system. So nobody's doing that.
Yeah.
And yet somehow we're ending up with that.
Yeah.
And I know you've written about this extensively. What do you think are some of the ways pastors, maybe early on or when they realize they're stuck, what are some moves that they can make? What are some ways you would encourage or challenge pastors and leaders to think about these things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, I do think what you're getting at is that moment where something begins to shift, or the wounds begin to compound, and there's that sense of like, I'm noticing that I'm becoming cynical or angry or judgmental or resigned, or I'm numbing in particular ways. And I don't like that. There's it's interesting. I'm involved in a project right now for the sake of pastors around secondary trauma, adjacent trauma. In other words, the death by 1,000 cuts, those little things that happen. The question is, how do we notice? What are the symptoms? What do we look for? I just named a few of them, but part of it is becoming aware of how these things impact us, and having communities, safe spaces that we're going to develop in time, particularly if we get some grant money, a protocol for pastors. But I do think it begins with, it's got to include community. So it's got to, you can't do this alone. You have to be known. And I would say by and large, we know, in fact, even as we talk about trauma, that trauma festers in aloneness. Like stress becomes trauma when we do life alone. And what we find, I'm sure I find, is that invariably when you engage a pastor who is in this place of pain and woundedness, and perhaps is beginning to wound others, or maybe has stepped out of ministry, they were doing it alone. Now they'll say, oh, no. I had so many good friends in ministry, but those friends were like direct report staff members that experienced the wrath of this pastor or
Yep.
the manipulation or other things like that. Oh, no. I've got a therapist, but it turns out that therapist, they weren't really doing a lot of work. In fact, the therapist was saying, good job. Appreciate you, brother. You're great. You just keep drinking deep of the gospel and everything will be fine. But they weren't really doing the soul work,
Yeah.
And so what we find is these guys, mostly guys, but there are women too, are really alone. They've had no one to talk to. They feel like if they're really vulnerable, they're afraid of what's going to happen. They're afraid of losing it all. They've learned to self-protect and they've become pretty insulated. And vulnerability is just really, really scary. And so, that sense that we were talking about in my story pretty early on where I didn't hit eject, I stayed in it. I didn't have a whole lot to lose. I was still pretty early in the game. But if you're the pastor of a church of, 500, 1,000, 3,000, whatever it might be, or the head of a ministry, and you're sitting with a guy like me, and I'm saying the path looks like this. And you're like, well, the path that got me here looks like this, I just kind of clench my teeth and I put on my armor and I do this thing,
Totally.
It's going to be really tough.
Yeah. Well, it's a different mode. So I've built a world in one mode. You're saying I need to be in another mode in order to be healthy.
Yeah.
How do I do this? It feels like you're asking me to be, like a gentle warrior. Like, am I a Navy SEAL or am I like what exactly am I?
Yeah.
That is really hard. That's not straightforward. Like you can't just gear shift like that. So let me run like three things at you and you tell me what you think.
Yeah.
So like for us, we're trying to build anonymous reporting structures. So in other words, anyone that's in any Vineyard church can call a third party and say, I have a concern about X, Y, or Z. We're trying to build anonymous help structures. So if you're a pastor or leader, you can call. We've paid for the beginning of you getting help because so many are trapped. So even right now, there's going to be a certain amount of people listening and they're going, that's me. Yeah. I'm having an extra drink or two or four. I'm looking at stuff online I know I shouldn't be looking at. I don't even know why I'm doing it, but it enables me to go to sleep at night or whatever. So to be able to have that, we're trying to aim at like boards. So it seems to me that boards, leadership teams, elder teams have an interesting opportunity to look at pastors and say, okay, one thing we're going to do for you is force you into certain types of solitude, for example. Yeah. For me, the number one thing I'm watching with pastors is if they can't be quiet and alone, that almost always means something eventually. Yeah. If we can just talk boards and elders into going, we're going to pay for you to be at this place for 2 or 3 nights every couple months. You can't take your phone. You leave your phone in the car. And then if you freak out, just freak out. It's okay. You'll be alone in your room. just cry a lot or and just write down whatever you're feeling. And then we're going to have some more work to do with somebody else. What are some of the ways that you would say to a board or a denomination like ours? We're not technically a denomination, but it's groups of churches. Yeah. Even pastors themselves, but you can start advocating for yourself. This is what I want to ask for. Yes. What are some things you think at least give us a shot? And I know it's not magic. I know. Yeah. But what are some things that you think give people a shot? Yeah, I think what you're talking about is spot on because what you're doing is you're making this normative. Right. You're building it into the system. And one of the things that, a number of us, I wrote on this, Scott McKnight, Laura Barron. Yep. There are a number of books that came out around the same time. And a number of us have been talking about this for years anyway. Yeah. But it sort of felt like triage mode, like we're in crisis and we need to just kind of name the reality of the pain, the abuse. What I love about what you're doing now is you're saying, let's step back. Let's just not react to a situation where a pastor is already blown up. Yep. Let's create policies. Let's use a system. Let's create structures. Let's create accountability that allows a pastor to say,
no matter where I am, whatever's going on in my life, whatever I'm feeling, whether I'm just feeling kind of numb, and I've done 10 funerals in the last month, and I just don't even cry anymore. To I'm looking at pornography. To my marriage is about to dissolve. Whatever it might be, it's okay. That's what I hear you doing. That's what I hear you saying is, we will make it possible for you to sound the alarm, so to speak. And then we want to find a way to get you into process, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe that looks like a sabbatical, some solitude. Maybe that looks, the prescription is different for each and every one of us, right? Yes. Maybe it's more dramatic and they need to do some intensive therapeutic work. Whatever it is, it's okay. This is what we do. I think that's what's really important here is like, this is normal. This is normative. I'm doing the work, continuing to do the work. We want you to do the work. Yes. I think that's this next step. We're all asking the question, what are the systems? What are the protocols? How do we make this a normative part of what we do within our system structures, denominations, networks?
Yes. Well, I just don't know. If you're in a lot of other professions like this, they build systems and processes and mechanisms by which you pay attention to this kind of thing. Yeah. So, for example, if you're in the military, you're not allowed to just continually do tours of duty. You just can't. Yeah. You're allowed to do a couple. Yeah. And now you got to stay home for a certain amount of time. You still are working, but you got to be off the front line. You're not allowed to keep engaging in battles that are going to traumatize you and disable your kind of higher reasoning and function. Yeah. We're going to pull you off. If you're a lawyer, for example, there's certain rules about what you engage in, what you don't engage in, what the rules are, and if you break those rules, you're not allowed to be a lawyer. Yeah. Like, you're done. So you can't defend certain kinds of families that is your family. You can't practice in certain ways. Doctors aren't allowed to operate on their own family. Why? Because there's rules. You gotta do clinical work in your office. On and on. I can keep going. So all of these different counselors. I mean, all the laws with counselors. Like, you break these laws, it's over. And we're going to be really clear. Like, you're in our office. This is when the session starts. This is when it ends. The pastors, it's so confusing. Like, I'm playing basketball with you on Tuesday. I'm at your kid's birthday party on Friday, and I'm teaching on Sunday. So I'm standing on a stage with lights on me. Yeah, every week. And then I'm going to meet you on Thursday because your wife says she wants to leave you. That's right. Okay, so... Too much, man. Who am I right now? Like, what? But so in my own head. Let alone... and that times 50, times 20, times 50, times 100, like, it's just so much, right? Yes. I mean, that's just the reality that you're naming. I train students down in seminaries, future pastors in seminary. We do all the things right, and still you graduate, you walk across that stage, you end up at your first church, and then I get the call 6 months in, like, what have I done? Totally. This is so much. I got the guy in my elder meeting each week who monopolizes and yells at me. I've got the person who continually wants my attention, all the things that you were just naming. And so it really is exhausting. The reality is 1, 2, 3, 5 years in, we do begin to get kind of numb to it. That's when the addictions start to set in. I'm drinking a little too much at night. I don't feel anymore. And so the work is shared, right? Like, I think I love what you're doing. And I think we're in a season right now, and there are seasons like this in the church where we're sort of building the plane as we're flying it, because we can't stop. Right. What's interesting to me, conversation like this with you, Jay, is that we're learning best practices from one another, and we're beginning to experiment. It sort of feels like the early church again. It sort of feels like the Reformation again, where it's like, we're probably going to get some things wrong, but let's, by all means, do something different. Yeah, right. Well, and it is hard. I mean, there's a book we've been handing out, Sustaining Ministry. It basically starts to ask these questions about power dynamics. I mean, I don't remember ever being in any class anywhere where people taught me about power dynamics. And in a church movement like ours, we are, I think, with the best intentions, trying to flatten all of those.
Yeah.
So I'm just a guy, right? I wear jeans and, I know about hip hop and I'll have a beer with you. And, I'm going to teach in a conversational way. And so I'm in my mind flattening all the power dynamics. I'm just
one of the guys.
I'm just a dude who loves the Bible and loves you. And, I'm going to pray.
But you have a lot of power.
It turns out I'm on a stage. There are lights on me. I feel I mean, however much I'm trying to flatten the space, I still have authority and have power.
Yeah.
And when the fact that I played basketball with you on Tuesday doesn't mean I'm somehow don't have a disproportionate amount of authority.
Yeah.
Specifically in relationship to maybe something goes on with your kid, or I still have to manage budgets and stuff. There's real money flying around. Yeah. So how do you think pastors get in touch with those realities? Because I'm a bit at a loss, if I'm honest. Because our movement has tried to flatten all that. There's lots of movements where you still wear the robes when you teach on Sunday, or you're taught to be really careful about how you form friendships with people in your church, or what are you finding that offers wisdom?
Yeah, well, a number of different things. I mean, a number of us have been talking about this now for years and saying, we've got positional power and emotional power and intellectual power and all these different levels of power. Even when we think we've removed the robes and the stoles and maybe even the stage, we still have that power. And so there's this growing recognition, what you're putting words to right now. There are a number of really good books out there that talk about one of Diane Langberg's most recent works on power. And her videos, if you just go to YouTube, she talks a lot about this kind of stuff. Really important. And then I think there's a whole other set of resources and mutual friends like Steve Cuss, Tricia Taylor, and Jim Harrington, who talk about differentiation, how we can be defined and connected. And a lot of pastors end up in one extreme or the other. They become enmeshed. They lose themselves in relationship, and there's no longer any sort of definition. I'm the pastor, you're the parishioner. Right. Others self-protect and cut themselves off from their congregations. They become cynical and hardened and distant. And so all of this is contributing to a growing body of wisdom, you might say, that, by the way, is all a part of pastoral care classes I teach. Yeah. That doesn't translate necessarily, for the person who they're not thinking about notes from my class, 5 years into ministry, Right. Totally. And a lot of this, I'll talk about, for instance, language that I'm sure you're familiar with, transference and countertransference in a relationship where, I'll talk to pastors nowadays. I do these 5-day 15-hour counseling intensives. Pastors have never heard of that before. You mean, there's something that goes on inside of me, that feeling that I have when I'm sitting with that really angry alpha man or that woman I'm really attracted to. That's what's going on inside of me. I got to pay attention to that. I've got to pay attention to what's going on inside of them. No one ever taught me that about all these invisible dynamics in relationships. And so I suspect that if someone's listening right now, there might be a sense of overwhelm. Like, you're naming things, Chuck and Jay, that there are no guarantees that I'm going to get this training, that this is a part of the structure and the systems within my church or denomination or network. Yeah. And the reality is that's true. Yeah. And so I'll often say, right now, it's on you to resource yourself. Yeah. Do what you can, join with a cohort. In other words, grab some other pastors, begin to engage these resources, read these books, begin to ask the kinds of questions that you're asking, because you're several steps ahead, more than several steps ahead in this conversation as you're beginning to implement new policy system structure. But by all means, get curious.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. Well, taking a learning posture. Yeah. Being humble enough to say, man, if all these people who tried really hard and were really gifted
Yeah.
screwed up in major ways. What are the odds that I'm bulletproof? They're pretty low.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think resourcing is important. I mean, the more that we can read and study and pay attention to these things, the better the odds are.
Mm-hmm.
We'll at least have some tools to manage these things moving forward, and being connected to other people. I mean,
some relationships. Yeah, that's right.
All the way back. I mean, when you said the key question I'm trying to get people to ask is, how do you experience me?
Mm-hmm.
That is a terrifying question to ask people, whether it's your spouse or your kids or some people you work with or some friends.
Yeah.
So, yeah, those are all some self-reflection, self-awareness, learning posture. Get some help. I mean, if you need some help, raise your hand, ask for help, get somebody to help you. We have resources we've been trying to build, but you have a bunch. Those are all really, really important tools.
And acknowledge even the overwhelm of listening to Jay and Chuck right now, and the parts of you that feel right now like I have to figure this out. We need to put policies in place. I need to learn about power. What I'd like to say, what I say to a lot of pastors when I'm doing the work, like, shh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Let's relax. Let's get centered. Let's get curious, and let's just take what's before us right now. You know, maybe you're curious about this conversation about power, right? Maybe there's a resource that you can begin to read, but you don't have to become an overnight expert. That's probably what got a lot of us into this place in the first place, right?
Yeah,
and so,
totally.
But we can begin to resource ourselves, and we can begin to ask questions of, let's say you're in a church, ask questions of your senior pastor, of your elder board, of your larger network and denominational structures. What are we doing about this? How are we addressing power dynamics, racism, sexism, other things like that we're realizing today we've largely ignored for a long, long time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Okay, well, let's finish with this. I have one last thought, and then we can be done.
Yeah.
If you could go back and talk to 27-year-old version of you, and just say, hey, man, here's some things that I want you to be thinking about, or here's something you need to be aware of. And you can't say, buy Apple stock. I mean, like you have to give them like thoughts about life. What would you want to say to that guy? Because there's a lot of that version of that guy. Super smart, really going for it. Just dangerous enough, like knows a little bit about himself enough. But what do you think? What would you want to say?
I think I'd probably first just stand before him, look him in the eye, make eye contact, and say, "Shh, it's okay. It's so overwhelming. It's hard. I know you're carrying so much shame and insecurity and anxiety. First, it's okay." I think the second piece is, Chuck, you're going to do a lot of work around self-awareness. You're going to learn about your story, get mad at your mom and dad, you're going to learn about your Enneagram, you're going to take certain assessments, learn what your Myers-Briggs is. But what you're going to realize is that perhaps the larger obstacle to you is your lack of self-regulation or your dysregulation. In other words, you learned at a very early age to live in sympathetic overactivation on this hamster wheel. And you've been going. And there's a different way. And that different way is in the depths of the Christian contemplative tradition. It's in some contemporary resources and practices that will allow you to find your way back to the still waters of God and to center. But I ended up real quick in a hospital in Cabo, Mexico, a Mexican hospital, in gallbladder surgery. And they discovered that my system was septic. I'd been pushing my body so hard. Now I was in San Francisco, and I was trying to do this self-awareness thing in a way that we could do it for church planners, and we do really well. That landed me in the hospital. And the body keeps the score, even when you're trying to do good things for the kingdom with some presumed self-awareness. What I didn't realize was how dysregulated I was, even with all of my awareness of myself, my story, my Enneagram, all this stuff. So I'd say, Chuck, be mindful of how dysregulated you are, and let's find ways to solitude, stillness, the still waters of God. And from there, let's just then become curious about what God might do.
Yeah. That's really good. I mean, it's amazing how simple these things get when you really get underneath it. Like, are you paying attention to your body? What a simple thought.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not sleeping, that means something. If you have consistent pains, it might not just be you lifted, that flower pot too quickly. There's parts of your body are telling you, we're not okay. We're not doing okay.
Yeah.
And
listen to your emotions, listen to your body, right?
Yeah.
Listen to your intrusive thoughts, your hypervigilance. There's a lot to pay attention to. That as you begin to read the dashboard, there are red lights flashing, yellow lights flashing, and you need to step back. Thank you, by the way, Jay, for beginning to implement new policies, new systems, new structures that allow for this to happen, allow for your pastors to say, yeah, there's a yellow light blinking on my dashboard. I'm really, really tired. I'm kind of numb, and I'm starting to engage in some things that I'm not so happy about. I need help. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would ask pastors when I first started doing this, I would ask pastors questions all the time about how to help people because I didn't know how to help anybody. I could just tell things were wrong. I realized I didn't have the tools.
Yeah.
And I remember asking one pastor once, what are you doing for men with porn? It just seems like a mess. And he said, oh, Jay, you don't want to lift that rock up because the stuff that crawls out from there, you won't be able to put back in the hole. It's too much of a mess. So preach the gospel, teach them to pray.
Yeah.
And that's what you got. And I thought, that doesn't seem like the right answer. And that's the danger. I mean, that's the scary part as pastors. When you start to ask these questions of yourself or of other people, you do have a pretty quick sense like, this could go to places I'm not prepared to manage. I'm not going to be able to do this. I remember one pastor saying, don't ask questions you don't want the answers to.
Yeah.
And
so
I remember being like,
that
doesn't seem right. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
That feels like we're punting on second down. Surely we should have some other plays to run here. I get that we can't do everything. I get it. But surely there's some plays to run. And so I'm just so grateful for men like you, women like Diane Lamberg, the work you're doing to assist people like me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I know you get lots of resistance. I know people push back, but I'm just really, really grateful. And thanks for taking time to talk today. Hopefully we get more time.
So good to connect.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.